John, what's going on here?
Well, I think that President Trump is flailing around. When the war started on February 28th, we launched this massive air campaign in conjunction with the Israelis against the Iranians. And that lasted until April 8th. So it went from February 28th to April 8th. And it was really our Sunday punch. And it failed. And on April 8th, President Trump declared a ceasefire. And since then, he has been searching for an alternative way to, in effect, win the war, or at least allow himself some sort of attractive exit strategy. And he's been unable to do that. And the reason is that Iran has won the war and we have lost the war. And President Trump just refuses to accept that. So what he constantly is doing is he's threatening to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age, or do something of that sort. But then when the moment of decision comes, he invariably backs off. And then he goes back to that same strategy in a few more weeks. And again, what he's doing here is he's flailing. He got himself into a disastrous situation. He got himself into a war where there is no plausible strategy that will allow him to win or allow him to save face. So he continues to flail around.
But I mean, things can only get worse for him in the sense that because he says his decision to cancel the attack at the weekend, quote, is subject to being able to rapidly make a deal. But presumably Tehran will refuse to surrender its strategic leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. John, why would Trump then agree to another deal if it doesn't guarantee freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz?
2 points, Tom. One is you and I have both argued for a long time on this show, the longer the war goes on, the more coercive leverage the Iranians have. And all sorts of statements come out of Tehran where prominent people in the leadership of Iran say that they have a vested interest in not rushing to get a deal because they believe, and I think quite correctly, that time is on their side. Now, the problem that President Trump faces, and the Iranians, of course, understand this, is that the economy is getting closer to the cliff the more time wears on. If you look at what we're doing in terms of taking oil out of the strategic petroleum reserve, if you look at what's happening on the inflation front and so forth and so on, there are all sorts of reasons to be deeply concerned about where the international economy is headed. And furthermore, President Trump has the midterm elections coming up, and he knows full well, and the Iranians know full well, that he does not want this unpopular war to continue.
Subscribe to the channel. All more breaking news, hot stories, and the
midterm elections. So President Trump has a deep-seated interest in ending this as quickly as possible. But the question is, how does he do it? As I said to you before, he does not have a plausible military strategy. He has no theory of victory. So at some point, he's going to have to surrender, which is what he did actually on June 17th when he signed the Memorandum of Understanding. That was a surrender document, but he ultimately could not accept it. And therefore, he violated the Memorandum of Understanding. But the argument I would make is that moving forward, he's going to have to agree to another Memorandum of Understanding because he has to shut this one down. And going back to my first point, I think that will be a tougher pill to swallow, that second Memorandum of Understanding, than the first one was.
Yeah, but Trump would say that it was Iran that violated the Memorandum of Understanding by continuing to attack shipping that attempts to transit the strait without its permission. John?
I don't think that's true. I think if you read Article 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding, which I've probably read about 10 times, it says that Iran and Oman will be responsible for controlling the strait in the 60-day period in which the negotiations that follow the MOU take place. After that, they'll decide what happens. But in the 60-day period, Iran mainly, and Oman to a lesser extent, will decide what ships go through and under what conditions. It says nothing about the United States in Article 5. So I think it's the Americans who violated the agreement.
Okay, well, all this comes in a week when Iran launched an unprovoked missile strike against the US base in Jordan. Let's bring in Paul Kelly here. Paul, what do you make of all this?
Tom, I think we're in a situation where Donald Trump is on the terrible horns of a double dilemma, a strategic dilemma and a domestic political dilemma within the United States, given the midterm elections are coming up. Trump can't win the war, but he's terrified of losing the war. He needs to evacuate this war. He needs to get out of the war. He needs a deal. He needs to cut a deal with the Iranians. But the trouble with this is that his position is sufficiently weak that he's unable to cut a viable strategic deal, which means the United States can walk away with a sense of pride and that Trump can walk away saying that he hasn't been humiliated. And so this is his terrible dilemma. He's got to get out of the war. He needs a deal. He wants to argue that the deal is a victory for him, but that's going to be a particularly difficult proposition to argue, to persuade people that is the case. Essentially, what's happened is the longer the war has gone on, the stronger the Iranian position and the weaker the American position. So, I mean, the logic of this is that Trump needs to bring this situation to an end. He doesn't know how to do it. And the longer he waits, the more difficult his strategic situation will be in the war, and the more difficult his domestic political situation will be within the United States. It is a truly agonizing dilemma, and there's no obvious way out for Donald Trump.
Yeah, but if the enthusiasts of military escalation, the neoconservatives and other hawks, if you like, I mean, if Trump followed their advice and he were to resume the bombing campaign, I mean, the Wall Street Journal makes this point in its editorial. It's not even clear what Trump's strategic objective would be. Paul.
Look, the problem with this war right from the start was there was a massive gap between the means and the ends. I mean, Trump was complacent, he was arrogant, he refused to identify realistic goals. I mean, he started out talking about regime change. He started talking about encouraging the Iranian people to rise up and overthrow the government. I mean, these were ludicrous war objectives. They were never going to be realized. The limits of military action, the limits of a air campaign were well known. He was contemptuous about taking cognizance of the fact that the Iranians might close the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, he didn't address that issue. He dismissed it when it came up in the Security Council and the pre-war deliberations. So essentially what we've got here is we've got a president who's been cavalier in terms of his pursuit of war objectives without proper preparation. He's been caught out as time has gone on. And so the person to blame for this overwhelmingly is Donald Trump himself.
Yeah, I mean, I had a discussion with the prominent British conservative columnist Peter Oborne just a few days ago on Switzerland, and you can watch that episode online. And we were just discussing that 3 days before he launched the strikes on February 28, he gave a State of the Union address that lasted 2 hours, but he dedicated only 30 seconds of that 2-hour State of the Union address to Iran. Quite extraordinary. John, just turning back a bit, you've said that Trump would have been insane to turn the dogs loose. But could this conflict still spiral out of control? After all, US allies, you think of Saudi Arabia, they were holding back for so long, yet they directly intervened just last week against Iranian-backed Shia militia in Iraq, while Iran retaliated against Jordan. So could things still spiral out of control? Could we still be on an escalation trap? John?
Well, I think as far as the Saudis are concerned, or any of the Gulf states, they have zero interest in seeing Trump escalate in the serious way he's been threatening. And in fact, all of the news reports say that MBS, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, talked to President Trump at great length yesterday, Saturday here, and convinced him in good part not to attack. So it's not going to escalate because of the Saudis. That's not to deny that the Saudis foolishly picked a fight with the Houthis, but that's another matter. With regard to the Iranians, I don't think the Iranians have a vested interest in provoking the United States to attack Iran the way President Trump has threatened. I would note, however, and I found this quite surprising, and it somewhat contradicts what I just said, Kuwait on Saturday, it's yesterday here, Kuwait, the Iranians attacked Kuwait yesterday. It was not a tit-for-tat operation where the United States had attacked Iran and Iran was attacking Kuwait in retaliation. Iran just decided yesterday, Saturday, to attack Kuwait. And this is the day when President Trump was threatening to escalate. So it was quite clear to me that the Iranians feel that they can poke him in the eye and get away with it. But I still don't think they want a full-scale war. I think if this escalates, it will be because President Trump is desperate. I think if you listen to Paul's description of Trump's situation and my description of Trump's situation, which were pretty much the same, he is in a desperate situation. And as I know from having studied a lot of international relations over the years, sometimes when states get into desperate straits, they do foolish things. And it is possible that President Trump may just gamble for resurrection and throw caution to the wind and launch the dogs. I don't think that's going to happen. I think he's going to move in the other direction, but who knows for sure?
Mind you, we've both said this so many times during the course of the last few weeks and months, and things always change again.
In a way, that's true, Tom, but in a way, it's not, which gets back to our earlier discussion. Trump threatens, then he backs off. Trump threatens, then he backs off. So in a way, it doesn't really change that much.
Paul, John mentioned that you both agree with each other about how Trump has executed this conflict. And since the February 28 strikes, your criticism of Trump has become progressively more severe. Now, by the end, you describe him as, in your columns for The Australian, a no wartime leader, inept, he's been outsmarted, someone who lacks the judgment to wage the conflict he had begun. Yet, Paul, throughout, you've argued that the initial decision to launch the war against Iran, that was justified. Looking back, how do you reconcile those two conclusions? Can a war still be justified if the leader who launches it proves fundamentally unsuited to conduct it? Paul.
I think that the war at the start could be justified, but not the sort of war that Donald Trump was waging, not the sort of war that Donald Trump was waging with his particular objectives. I think that a more limited war could have been justified, a war which was designed to significantly weaken the Iranian military and industrial capability, a war which was designed to reinforce to Iran that there would be a military price to pay in terms of its ambition to develop a nuclear weapon, a war which would further weaken Iran's capacity to support its proxies in the region, given that Iran has been the major source of instability in this region for a very long period of time, and it was strategically appropriate that Iran be forced to pay a military and strategic price for its war. However, since then, what's become readily apparent is that Donald Trump is no strategic presidential leader, that he is no war leader. I think there are two enormous difficulties here. Trump chopping and changing all the time has exposed to the entire world, let alone the Iranians, that he does not have a steel sense of purpose in this war, that he is confused, that he doesn't know what to do. And a president sending this message to the world and sending this message to his rival is a really devastating thing to do. I think the second point to make is Trump is weak in America. It's very clear that Donald Trump cannot carry the American public in terms of a more concerted military strategy against Iran. This, again, is apparent to the Iranians, it's apparent to the world, it's apparent to Moscow, it's apparent to Beijing. And I think this is a really devastating message, because the main objective of the United States in today's world is to have credibility when it comes to deterrence, particularly credibility in East Asia when it comes to China. And one's got to ask, what do we think the Chinese government is thinking watching Trump and understanding his weakness as a strategic leader, his weakness as a war leader, and his inability to mobilize American opinion behind a war cause? Just think about all that.
A justified war against Iran, poorly executed. John.
Yeah, I want to respond to Paul said. You want to remember, Paul and Tom, that last year, this is in 2025, the United States and Israel launched the limited war against against Iran. It lasted 12 days from June 13th to June 25th of 2025. And the war ended for two reasons. One is that the Israelis and the Americans were running out of missiles to shoot down the incoming Iranian ballistic missiles. And all of this tells you that even with a limited war, the fact is that those Iranian ballistic missiles and Iranian drones, for that matter, are a deadly threat. And knocking them down and protecting Israel or protecting the Gulf states is a very difficult task, even in a limited war. The second point I would make to you is that Trump got wind back in the June 2025 war that the Iranians were thinking about shutting down the strait. And he got spooked. And that was the reason that we were so anxious to end the war. And many people argued at the time, and I was one of them, that from an Iranian point of view, they were foolish to agree to end the war in June of 2025. They should have continued the war. They should have shut down the strait, and they should have continued firing ballistic missiles at Israel, because Israel and the United States no longer had a significant capability to knock those incoming missiles and drones down. But anyway, all of this is to say that if you launch a limited war, you run into many of the same problems that we have run into when President Trump launched this massive attack.
Yeah, and isn't it, Paul, that every administration since George W. Bush have war-gamed a preventive strike on Iran, and they all came to the conclusion that the consequences would be, you know, as John's talking about, Iran shutting down the Strait of Hormuz or smashing the Sunni Gulf states with ballistic missiles. So the question here is, can a morally justified war be just? Can that be justified if its architects have no coherent theory of victory?
Well, Tom, these are important issues, and I think the points that John has just made are highly pertinent and very powerful points, and I do take them on board. That is, what he's arguing is that even a limited war would be highly dubious given the history, and I understand that particular point. I guess what I'd say is that a lot of this problem goes back to the deficiencies of the American national security system and the actual decision-making process leading up to this decision. Now, we've read quite a lot in the media about what exactly happened, but I guess my questions are as follows. What military advice did Trump get about this undertaking? In particular, was he advised by the American military that his objectives could be achieved in a short period of time, that is 4, 5, 6 weeks? On what basis did he get that advice, if he did get the advice? And then when it comes to American munitions, when it comes to the American military-industrial complex, given America's responsibilities in the wider world, what sort of advice did he actually get about that? So I think these are pretty important questions. I think the final question, as you point out about the Pentagon war games, of course, every Pentagon war game about this war identified the issue with the Strait, identified the fact that the Iranians...
Subscribe to the channel. All more breaking news, hot stories, and the latest updates are coming next week. Don't miss out.